Brooding and incandescent, the lines of Theodore Roethke's poem In a Dark Time, tightropes between desperate existential rumination and genuine spiritual reflection. And yet submerged within the dark tone of the poem is the telltale glimmer of hope and release from the confines and strictures of existence. Before we begin, please like, subscribe, and comment down below. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Born on May 25, 1908, in Saginaw, Michigan, Theodore Roethke's tumultuous and bucolic upbringing would greatly influence his poetry, with overarching themes of nature, mysticism, and the complexities of existence. His father died of cancer when he was 14, and his uncle committed suicide shortly after. Before Roethke's untimely passing in 1963, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. His deeply introspective approach would greatly influence a generation of highly regarded poets, including Sylvia Plath and Richard Hugo. Roethke struggled with his mental health, and while that certainly informed his poetry, his work was not without a definite spiritual longing beyond the confines of his suffering. In fact, the Vintage Book of Contemporary Poetry characterized Roethke's work as, quote, the transformation of a self into a soul. Those spiritual complexities and mental issues are most evident in Roethke's poem, In a Dark Time. Here it is in full. In a dark time, the eyes begin to see. I meet my shadow in the deepening shade. I hear my echo in the echoing wood, a lord of nature weeping to a tree. I live between the heron and the wren, beasts of the hill and serpents of the den. What's madness but nobility of soul at odds with circumstance? The day's on fire. I know the purity of pure despair, my shadow pinned against a sweating wall. That place is among the rocks. Is it a cave or winding path? The edge is what I have. A steady storm of correspondences, a night flowing with birds, a ragged moon, and in broad day the midnight come again. A man goes far to find out what he is, death of the self in a long, tearless night, all natural shapes blazing unnatural light. Dark, dark my light, and darker my desire. My soul, like some heat-maddened summer fly, keeps buzzing at the sill. Which I is I? A fallen man, I climb out of my fear. The mind enters itself, and God the mind, and one is one, free in the tearing wind. At first glance, one is struck by the very meter of the poem. It's written in iambic pentameter and follows a peculiar ABCADD rhyme scheme in each of its 4 stanzas that evokes the sound of someone nervously whistling in a dark and foreboding forest where the vast expanse of trees loom and teeter above one's entire being. Divorced from any religious or spiritual sensibility, the poem is bleak, despairing, and even borders on a sincere kind of madness. It even echoes the deeply confessional and sometimes solipsistic poems of Robert Lowell, Anne Sexton, or Sylvia Plath. Upon first reading In a Dark Time, I was immediately drawn to the lines in the second stanza and found myself ruminating on them for a spell. Roethke writes, "What's madness but nobility of soul at odds with circumstance?" A more relatable line could not be found amid so much dystopian despair that informs our current lot with all its attendant issues, whether it be loneliness, addiction, isolation, or even simply our petulant contempt for our very own existence ad nauseum. Certainly nobility and virtue seem to be at a premium. It seems we can't even define them, much less come to know them in this day and age, with all notions of truth deconstructed into narcissistic oblivion. Regardless, that particular line has often been a refrain of sorts in my own life and begins to make sense only from a religious and spiritual vantage point. In a Dark Time in its entirety seems to echo the dark spiritual juxtapositions found in the Duino Elegies by Renée Maria Rilke, with its brooding meditations on God and the self. Only Roethke's poem is tinged by agitation that verges on a spiritual panic, whereas Rilke always seems to find repose even in the darkest pits of his soul. Or perhaps In a Dark Time echoes the spiritual bewilderment that Muslim Sufis such as Ibn Arabi or Rumi discuss at length in their many works. Our yearning toward God and beatitude seem to be at odds with our egoic self. There is a refusal to let go, and in that refusal, madness emerges. This certainly seems evident at the end of Roethke's poem. Quote, "Which I is I, a fallen man, I climb out of my fear. The mind enters itself, and God the mind, and one is one, free in the tearing wind." Those final lines also bring to mind the oft-quoted phrase from the Hindu Upanishads, Tattvam Asi, essentially Atman is Brahman. That is, our small human self is ultimately and inexorably connected to God, but we must endeavor to discover this in this life or the next through hardship, reflection, and a steadfast hope that ultimately we are in good hands. Still, In a Dark Time is less a guidepost or an instruction, and more of a spiritual outburst filled with both foreboding and enchantment toward the very joys and chasms that defined Theodore Roethke's tumultuous life and, in a very real sense, all of us. Read the poem again, and if you haven't already, like and comment down below with your own impressions and understanding of Roethke's dark, foreboding, and ultimately transcendent poem.